When I find myself at the tail end of a long and sometimes arduous work period, there's really nothing better than hunkering down and figuring out a 10 to 20 hour experience. Escapism is truly the name of the game at this point, and finding a new title which I can dump time into and just escape is all I really need to be satisfied with the games that I play. Something funny is happening though. I feel like we can all state that video games have been becoming progressively more complicated. Games where you need to log in every day. Games that require their own hard drive for absolutely no reason. Games costing more. Games lying to you. And games just flat out not working are all issues which I am fully accustomed to at this point. Unlike many of the takes which I have heard being echoed throughout the internet, this doesn't really ruin video games for me. But it does make me a much more cautious consumer when purchasing them. There's an underlying increase in the number of complications surrounding this medium of entertainment. And with new releases getting seemingly shadier and shadier, I find myself reminiscing over older titles which I have nothing but fond memories of. This is partially why I started making these videos, because at this point, it can be more fun just talking about some of the games I liked, rather than actually finding new ones to play. I could write on the broader issues within the video game landscape for what seems like hours, but to be quite honest, I just don't want to subject myself to that. I can be an exceedingly critical person when it comes to shit like this, but yet again, I make these videos for fun in my spare time, and being overly negative about the broader issues in gaming only seems like a chore to me. The reason why I brought all of this up has been to properly lay down the groundwork for discussing a game which has been on my mind recently. It's a game which came out a little while ago at this point, but through replaying it, I've been reminded of the simple feeling of escape, which has been hard to come by recently. I will continue to give context on why this is the case throughout the video, but Mirror's Edge is a pretty great game, and even looking beyond that, it's a very interesting one as well. And it's one which I feel is absolutely worthy of discussion. With my justification for this video laid out, let me introduce you to the game which has been on my mind lately. Mirror's Edge is a really strange game. It has an insanely fleshed out parkour system, and it's one which not many games I know of have taken influence from. To put it quite simply, this is a game with very few contemporaries. It's breathtaking in its art design, while also not being visually cluttered, being just simple enough for the player to effectively assess their surroundings while moving at a very fast pace. This game allows for the player to create their own solutions to obstacles as they approach them, but the most obvious answer may not always be what's best, or at least what's most fun. If anything is coming across through my dollar store pitch of this game, I hope that it's the understanding of this game's uniqueness, as this is why this game is still loved 15 years after its initial release. To get out of the way now, I'm absolutely not going to state that Mirror's Edge is a perfect game. It has numerous issues, many of which are entirely severe enough to completely ruin this experience for many. It's extremely short, has awful cutscenes, flawed combat, and is not an extremely polished title. To put it honestly, if I had paid full price for this game at launch, I probably would have been quite mad at its offering. But I didn't, and neither do you. This game throws a lot of mechanics at the wall during its runtime, and many of them should have been left on the cutting room floor. The boss fights add nothing, and most of the cutscenes are completely unnecessary, and kind of boring. This game would have been better off if they trimmed the fat and doubled down on what it does well. The parkour mechanics are unmatched. The time trial mode fits this game incredibly well, and the set pieces can be excellent. These are the elements which people remember fondly of this game. And even in its flawed state, Mirror's Edge still gives the player a shocking amount of agency when navigating through its environments. Along with this, the first-person perspective allows the player to be completely enthralled by its world. Jumping from roof to roof, sliding down the slopes of metropolitan skyscrapers, and getting shot at by attack helicopters are the moments where this game comes into its own. The set pieces help distinguish Mirror's Edge. They had just come off the heel of creating some of the best Battlefield titles to date, and their talents for creating insane set pieces are very present throughout this game. And despite the fact that these moments are very linear in nature, the scripted set pieces never take control away from the player, and you always feel empowered to navigate these scenarios as you wish. Agency during movement was essential for making this game click, and luckily, this game absolutely clicks. Now, you may look at the gameplay and think, this doesn't really look that interesting. And I'd understand that perspective entirely. It's quite difficult to describe the appeal of this title to somebody who's never played it. Looking at the movement, you may think that it looks cinematic and fluid, but absolutely nothing to write home about. In an attempt to dispel this notion, and to describe the feeling that this game's movement elicits from the player, I would like to propose a question. How many button inputs do you think this is? Like 1? 2? 10? How many button inputs do you think are required for the player to be engaged? While I wouldn't magically put this game into the same ballpark as StarCraft, the point I'm trying to make does allow me to explain this game much more effectively. While the movement is simplistic and fluid, the game's demands of the player are just enough that they are always engaged during gameplay. Think of it this way. When jumping a fence in this game, you need to sprint, execute the jump, flex the character's legs, and then roll on the ground. Understood? All of these actions have individual inputs which are required to execute them. In almost every single other first-person game I know of, the player would need at most 2 inputs to do the same movement: sprint and vault. Now, as I was previously stating, these requirements are not overly complicated, but the increased attention which they demand from the player elevates this game's experience exponentially. When you roll on the ground, it almost feels like you're parrying it to mitigate fall damage. This is not common. I've never played another game which does this. And the visual feedback which Mirror's Edge provides for things like rolling and seeing your legs when you tuck them in makes every single small movement feel so much weightier. Speaking of the visual component, moving in this game is absolutely heightened by its art style. I have already stated this, but the simplicity of this game's art design never tries to steal the player's attention for too long, being very simplistic by design, but also sophisticated enough to create a somewhat believable world. For every moment you decide to look at the surrounding environments, you can rest assured that it will look artistically stunning in its own right. Take Cyberpunk's futuristic aesthetic, but sterilize it to a point where it almost feels like someone stripped back an utopic rendition of it, and that's essentially what encompasses this game's style. It's surreal, and it feels dreamlike in its design. I am hoping that this doesn't come across as being too general, but if I had to distill the exact emotions which this game's world design elicits from me, I would say that it's a very warm feeling. I don't really understand how to describe it any further than this, but it's almost like reading a comic book rendition of a metropolis. It feels extremely sterile in a unique way. I don't really know how to expand on this further, as it's so subjective, but whatever it is, I like it. I like it a lot. So, I've covered most of the great aspects of this game's mechanics and art design. Now, what other promising elements are there in Mirror's Edge? Surprisingly little. Most of the elements which I haven't discussed have been stripped down into their most simple form. This is why I stated earlier that I would have been upset if I bought this game at launch. Mirror's Edge is like a musical demo track. It's a framework for a much better product down the road. The general ideas and design components of this game are great, but the connective tissues which fuse them together, like the story, cinematics, and even the music to a certain extent, are compromised. The cutscenes are quite boring. Every single time a cutscene starts, I get the feeling that I'm being pulled away from the game, and I always wanted to skip these cutscenes when they popped up. It definitely doesn't help that the story is kind of a mess, and this is especially unfortunate because the world is actually somewhat interesting. The boss fights and combat as a whole really feels quite forced. This game did not need these elements. They bogged down the title and removed focus from what really shines within this game. DICE should have probably doubled down on making more interesting and dynamic levels, and with this, a larger focus on the more arcade-like and gamey aspects of Mirror's Edge. I am not aware of the community consensus on this next opinion of mine, but I also really think that the music should have been more engaging. There are some great tracks, but generally speaking, the music takes a more passive and ambient approach. I believe that this was the incorrect decision for a game as fast-paced as Mirror's Edge, but maybe I just don't get it. If Mirror's Edge was the demo track, then most would think that it would be the sequel's responsibility to elevate the first game's mechanics while cutting everything that did not work. Did this happen in Mirror's Edge Catalyst? Well, not really. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is also a mixed bag, one with silver linings quite like the first, albeit very different ones. Its open-world approach may have deepened the player's connections to the environment, but it also showed DICE's inability to create interesting encounters on a large scale. The side quests are alright, while also being very repetitive. In fact, I would probably state that the missions in the second game did not get nearly enough time in the oven. Along with this, the game's combat has been entirely overhauled, and is much better off for it. But is this really where the focus should have gone during development? I have just as many criticisms for the second title as I do for the first, and both are not great, but are good games, with some caveats. Are they worth playing? Absolutely. But if they make another title in the series, I would like to see a Mirror's Edge game where they fully dive into what makes these titles so compelling. The first game's time trial mode allowed for players to realize the full potential of its mechanical sandbox, and the second game was almost able to capitalize on the arcane nature of the movement within these games through various open-world activities. However, the challenges should have been better though. This is where I stand on the series as of right now, and I'm sure that EA is not quite done milking this franchise. I heard that there were some rumors of a remake for the first title, but this hasn't really come into fruition anytime recently. So, for now, I believe that it may be for the best to moderate any hopes I have for a future title within this series. I've been thinking about Mirror's Edge for a while now, and I'm extremely happy that I got the opportunity to vocalize my opinions on these titles. They're simple games, but in a time where video games are getting more and more complicated, I find myself appreciating the straight-to-the-point nature of these titles, even though I am somewhat conflicted on their composition. Now that I got this off my chest, I would like to thank anybody who took the time out of their day to watch this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.